Finally, fact number 4, the original disciples believed that Jesus was risen from the dead despite their having every predisposition to the contrary. Think of the situation the disciples faced following Jesus' death. Number 1, their leader was dead. And Jewish messianic beliefs had no idea of a Messiah who, instead of triumphing over the enemies of Israel, would be shamefully executed by them as a common criminal. The Messiah was supposed to throw off Israel's enemies, and in this case that meant Rome, and reestablish the throne of David in Jerusalem, to which Jew and Gentile alike would be subject, not to suffer defeat at the hands of the Gentiles and suffer the ignominious death of a common criminal. Secondly, according to Jewish law, Deuteronomy 21:23, Jesus' execution as a criminal showed him out to be a man literally under God's curse. You see, the catastrophe of the crucifixion for these early disciples was not simply that Jesus was dead, that their leader and friend was gone, but rather that according to Jewish law, the crucifixion showed in effect that the chief priests and the Jewish authorities had been right all along, that they had been following a heretic, a man literally accursed by God. Thirdly, Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead to glory and immortality before the general resurrection of the dead at the end of the world. Confronted with Jesus' crucifixion, all the disciples could do was simply, at most, to preserve their master's tomb as a shrine where his bones could reside until that day when they and all the righteous dead of Israel would be reunited with him in the kingdom of God and raised by God to glory. Nevertheless, despite every predisposition to the contrary, the original disciples believed in and were willing to go to their deaths for their belief in the fact of Jesus' resurrection. Luke Johnson, who is a prominent New Testament critic from Emory University, muses some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement earliest Christianity was. You need a launching pad to launch this missile. In summary, then, there are 4 facts agreed upon by the majority of New Testament scholars today who have written on this subject, and which any adequate historical hypothesis must account for. Jesus' burial by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb, the discovery of his empty tomb by his women followers, his post-mortem appearances to various individuals and groups, and the very origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. So the question is, what is the best explanation of these 4 facts? This is where the disagreement arises. Scholars are fairly united on the historicity of these facts. The disagreement comes with how you best explain them. Most scholars, I think, would probably simply remain agnostic about this question. Many of them will say that as historians they cannot entertain a miraculous or supernatural hypothesis like the resurrection simply for methodological reasons. But the Christian can maintain that the hypothesis that best explains these facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. In his book, Justifying Historical Descriptions, the historian C.B. McCullough lists 6 tests which historians use in determining what is the best explanation for a given body of historical facts. And I believe that the hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, passes all of these tests. Number 1, it has great explanatory scope. It explains why the tomb was found empty, why the disciples saw post-mortem appearances of Jesus, and why the Christian faith came into being. Second, it has great explanatory power. It explains why the body of Jesus was gone, why people repeatedly saw Jesus alive despite his earlier public execution, and so forth. 3, it is plausible. Given the historical context of Jesus' own unparalleled life and claims, the resurrection serves as a divine confirmation or vindication of those allegedly blasphemous claims for which he was crucified. Number 4, it is not ad hoc, that is to say, contrived. It requires only one additional hypothesis, and that is that God exists. And that needn't even be an additional hypothesis if you already believe that God exists. And I think that we do have sound philosophical arguments for the existence of God. Number 5, it is in accord with accepted beliefs. The hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, doesn't in any way conflict with the belief that people don't rise naturally from the dead. The Christian accepts that belief as wholeheartedly as he accepts the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead. And finally, number 6, it far outstrips any of its rival hypotheses in meeting criteria 1 through 5. Down through history, various alternative explanations of these 4 facts have been offered. For example, the conspiracy hypothesis, that the disciples stole the body of Jesus and lied about the resurrection appearances. The apparent death hypothesis, that Jesus was taken down from the cross alive and somehow escaped from the tomb and presented himself to the disciples. The hallucination hypothesis, that the disciples hallucinated post-mortem visions of Jesus and so forth. Such hypotheses, however, have been nearly universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. None of these naturalistic hypotheses succeeds in meeting the 6 criteria as well as does the resurrection hypothesis. Now, this puts the skeptical critic in a rather desperate situation. For example, a few years ago, I had a debate on the resurrection of Jesus at the University of California with a professor who had written his doctoral thesis on the evidence for the resurrection. He was thoroughly familiar with the evidence, and he could not deny the facts of the honorable burial, the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, or the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. And so his only recourse was to come up with some alternative explanation of these facts. And so he argued that Jesus of Nazareth must have had an unknown identical twin brother who was separated from him at birth, who grew up independently, no one knew about him, but who came back to Jerusalem just at the time of the crucifixion, stole his brother's body out of the tomb, and presented himself to the disciples, who mistakenly thought that Jesus had risen from the dead. Now, I'm not going to go into how I went about refuting this theory, but I think that the example is instructive because it shows to what desperate lengths skepticism must go in order to explain away the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. In fact, did you know that the evidence is so powerful that one of the leading Jewish theologians of today, the late Pinchas Lapid, who taught at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Jewish theologian, declared himself convinced on the basis of the evidence that the God of Israel raised Jesus of Nazareth from the dead. Now, if this is right, it has profound implications. The significance of the resurrection of Jesus lies in the fact that it's not just any old person that has been raised from the dead, but it is Jesus of Nazareth, whose crucifixion was instigated by the Jewish leadership because of his blasphemous claims to divine authority. If this man has been raised from the dead, then the God whom he allegedly blasphemed has publicly and unequivocally committed himself to him and vindicated those claims. The resurrection of Jesus is God's divine confirmation of Jesus' claims to have divine authority and to be the absolute revelation of God. Thus, in an age of religious pluralism and relativism, the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus constitutes, I think, a solid rock on which Christians can take their stand on God's decisive self-revelation in Jesus.
I wanted to talk to you about an article you wrote, I think it was for the Expository Times, where you were responding to Byron McCain.
Yes.
You were arguing against that Jesus' burial was dishonourable. But I think in the social setting of the New Testament, well, the first century, that a criminal such as Jesus would have been buried dishonourably. But I think also there's that this can be served as an argument for the empty tomb. If it was dishonourable, then
yes,
it wouldn't have been something they would have invented, such a burial. And there's also like other things relating to social science, such as that the crucifixion was more than just a curse from God. It was also a shameful death and
yes,
so on. So I wanted to know what you thought of arguments from social science.
Let me give those of us who haven't read the article some background. The scholar that he refers to argues that, in fact, what Joseph of Arimathea gave Jesus was not an honorable burial, even though it was in a tomb. He says that it was a dishonorable burial because it didn't involve mourning and Jesus wasn't laid in the family tomb. And as you say, I think McCain's motive actually in writing this or contending this is to raise the credibility of the burial account, not to diminish it. He thinks it's more credible if we regard Joseph as an unsympathetic emissary of the Sanhedrin charged with disposing of the body of this criminal. But in my response to this, I'm just not convinced. Apart from one's motivation to enhance the credibility of the burial narrative, I think you have to look at the specific evidence. And what I argue is that while he's quite right in thinking that a dishonorable burial would be more probable given the general Jewish background information that we have, nevertheless, when you look at the specific evidence that we have in this case for Joseph, that it makes it more probable that he gave him an honorable burial.